I started playing Magic in 1994 when I was 9 years old. At that age, the game was about finding the cards that you loved and trying to make those cards the ones you build around. Now I'm much older and I know a lot more about the game, but now I can build decks using my heart and my brain. This is Magic the Gimmicking, where I take silly themes, concepts, or restrictions and turn them into powerful EDH decks. Hey everybody, welcome back to Zulu's Board Game Cafe. It's me, MC Squared, and we are here for Magic the Gimmicking, Episode 2. This is going to be the second installment of the show where I take weird themes, concepts, and ideas and turn them into playable EDH decks that aren't just going to get knocked around by regular good stuff decks. This time, we're going to be taking a look at a Vorthos deck, which is to say a deck that cares more about the plot, the lore, the theme of Magic and its characters, more than it cares about just putting together a combination of cards that is powerful. And for this deck, we are going to be focusing on the crew of the Weatherlight, the original Skyship, the first real codified heroes of the Magic storyline. These characters were first featured in and around the Mirage block and proceeded to be more or less the main characters of the Magic storyline all the way up through the Invasion block, Invasion, Planeshift, and Apocalypse. And they were revisited again in a recent set of the pre-constructed Commander decks, where a lot of them got revamps and had new cards. So there's a really wide array of interesting cards that can go with this theme, which is why I really like it. I've been in love with these characters for a long time. When I started playing Magic, it was just as these sets were coming out and these characters were being introduced, so very special place in my heart. And as you might guess, the commander for this deck is none other than Sisay, the Weatherlight Captain. This is actually Sisay's second card. She was introduced as part of Modern Horizons and is a fantastic 5-color commander. She's a very popular 5-color commander for your traditional legendary tribal decks, where it's just she fishes out the best possible option, she puts together combos, she puts together battle cruisers, and it's all this big, stompy, go-off nonsense. But this deck is much more, like I said, Vorthos-y, about the lore, about the characters. So even though the commander might be one that you'll sit down at the table and people will go, oh, not Captain Sisay, you can rest assured that it will not quite be as devastatingly combo-heavy as the traditional Weatherlight Captain decks that you're used to seeing. So I'm going to go through a lot of the cards for this. Mostly I'm going to focus on the crew and the characters themselves. Then I'm going to go over a few of the powerful EDH cards that are related to the crew and the Weatherlight and its adventures. Point out some themes that you can build around, a few of the best cards that are available in the allotment. We'll talk a little bit about the lore itself, how these characters are related, what was going on in the context of any given card, and then we'll just throw all those ideas out there. And if you want to take a look at something like this, feel free. This concept actually has a whole lot of options, since there's over almost a dozen characters involved, and there's so many references to them throughout Magic's history. There's a lot of options for how to build this deck, and I really like the versatility that it shows, even when maintaining such a specific theme. So that's really cool. The first card I want to talk about, other than the commander itself, is... Well, first we'll talk about the commander's second card, Captain Sisay. Get all that out of the way. And we'll talk about who Sisay is. Sisay is actually one of the first people exposed to Urza's little science fair project, where he was essentially doing eugenics on people in Zulfir and Dominaria, trying to give them superpowers while he was preparing for the Phyrexian invasion. And Sisay's family was one of the first people subjected to that. And when Sisay was born, it turned out that she was immune to magic. So Sisay's core feature in the plot is that she is, of course, not affected by magic spells and things. She's only susceptible to physical harm, which you don't see on any of her cards, but actually do kind of see in her Descendants card that we got when we went back to Dominaria. But we're not going to worry about that right now. We'll get into all of the future Weatherlight Crew characters and all of those old references as we go. Right now we're just talking about Sisay. And her other card, Captain Sisay, is another fantastic card for this deck. just as a tap, fishes up legendary permanents out of your deck. Super, super useful for getting whichever card you need next. Another card that is very, very powerful on its own, any context. So great for this deck if you want to run it. The version I run of this deck does only run one of each of the characters because I am incredibly limiting on myself that way. But honestly, if you wanted to make this deck and make it powerful, that's not how I would do it. So both versions of Sisay, great cards to be in the deck. And the next card we're going to look at is, of course, the Weatherlight itself. There are 2 Weatherlight cards, and one of them is the original, which was Skyship Weatherlight from Plane Chase. This card is not honestly great for the Commander format just because it broadcasts so heavily and takes so long to do what it needs to do. So when you play it, you're going to go get all these cards that you potentially want and sit it under it, and you can only get one of them back each turn, and that's just telling your opponents, hey, I'm fishing up the good stuff that I need to win the game, to set myself up for success. So it's really, really, really begging to be destroyed. So other than maybe playing it once, getting one card out of it, not great. So I can't really recommend this one. But the new one from Dominaria, the Weatherlight, is a fantastic card. It's a vehicle, it's not too difficult to crew, and all you got to do is tag with it, and then it's sorted card advantage. You get to pull historic cards. This deck will have a decent number of artifacts in it. Every single creature in it is going to be legendary. We'll get into options for that when we go into breakdowns of other things, but most of the time, any creature in the deck is going to be legendary. And no sagas really, but still, plenty of opportunities to grab historic cards out using the Skyship Weatherlight, and that is just a fantastic choice of a card. So the Weatherlight from Dominaria is the instance of the Weatherlight you want to be using for this deck. And as far as some of the lore behind the Weatherlight is another Urza invention. Almost all these characters are largely influenced by Urza in some way. Urza himself is not in the deck because he never actually spends that much time as a person on board the Weatherlight, and kind of throws off the whole vibe to have him in there because he's more of the influencer and not the actual part of the story for most of the Weatherlight's escapades. You can throw him in there because he is part of the invasion block there at the end, but I don't necessarily run him because I like to focus on more of their original story, the Tempest block and Mercadian Masks adventures, but that's up to you. Not the point. Point is, the Skyship Weatherlight was invented by Urza, is built in the Tolarian Academy. It's part of the Legacy, which is Urza's legacy, all of the artifacts that he built to help fight against the Phyrexians, and the Weatherlight is one of the key components to that. It is a skyship that can actually move from plane to plane. It is an artificial means of planeswalking, which was rare then, even rarer now in the current state of Magic's lore. The point is, it was a very, very powerful skyship, made of all sorts of components from all corners of Dominaria. The wood for it was grown by a seed that was donated from Multani to Urza, and the magic that powers it is actually the result of Urza accidentally committing genocide on Sarah's realm before it collapsed. And he kind of just collapsed all of the energy of Sarah's plane into a little battery that he uses to power his plane-jumping skyship. So, kind of awful. But that's the origin of the ship itself. So that is the Weatherlight and her captain. Next, we're going to go start talking about the crew, all of the people that have served on the ship for a lengthy amount of time, and what their roles were, and all of that. We're going to talk about all their cards. Luckily, all of them have gotten cards, which is great. So we'll be able to run everybody, except for one, because he's banned. But we kind of like that he's banned, because his card would be terrible in this deck. We'll get to that at the end. The first one is actually probably the protagonist of a lot of the story, which is Gerrard. Gerrard Capuchin, I don't know if I've ever heard that word pronounced out loud before, is another one of Urza's science fair projects. It was the result of Urza's eugenics designed to create the perfect person to fight against the Phyrexians. So Gerrard is essentially the perfect man. And he has gotten 2 cards in his time. The first one is just his name, Gerrard Compassion. He gains you life every turn based on cards in hand, and he's got some combat trickery to tap things down when he attacks. He's fine. I run him in the deck. He's the better of the 2 Gerrard cards, in my opinion, because he's reliable, keeps your life total up, and he's a 3-4 for 5. Not a great creature, but certainly a functional one that helps keep you alive. And if you need to help keep opponents' creatures tapped out, he's useful. His other card, Gerrard Weatherlight Hero, kind of only works once, but he does a very powerful thing, but it broadcasts really hard, so it's hard to make him useful unless you are forcing him to be useful. This deck luckily does have access to a decent amount of board wipes, so there is a lot of potential to combine him with something strong, particularly the card Cataclysm, which is part of this deck. So I do recommend running him if you want to have the really big plays. He is a useful Gerrard to have, but he's only going to be useful the one time as opposed to the original Gerrard, which is just going to sit around and gain you life. The next member of the crew is probably one of the most powerful from a card perspective. That is Hannah. Hannah is the daughter of Baron and Rain, also mildly influenced by Urza's Eugenic Science Fair projects. And she is the navigator of the Weatherlight and the caretaker of the legacy. So she is there to kind of protect all of the artifacts that the ship carries and the ship itself. Her one card is Hannah, Ship's Navigator. It's actually been reprinted several times. She's only 3 mana, and her activated ability lets you grab enchantments and artifacts out of the yard back into hand. And since a lot of the artifacts in this deck are one-off sacrifice artifacts, and you actually have some enchantments that do that as well, she's actually got a whole lot of potential for use, recycle on various powers on cards, which is just excellent. And is always a great card. She's very small, she's just a little 1/2, so she's pretty susceptible to removal, but excellent to have around all the same. Next up is Tahngarth, Sisay's best friend and the Weatherlight's first mate. He's a Talrum warrior that has 2 awesome cards, and they both go really well into this deck. The first is his original card, Tahngarth, Talrum Hero. He's a 4/4 vigilance for 5. It's fine, but what is cool about him is he's got a built-in fight mechanic, which means Tahngarth can just punch away any notable problem creature that happens to show up. So if someone's got small combo piece creatures that they need to get their stuff online, or something that they have to spend time building up, Tahngarth is there to just punch them out. Fantastic. And second card, part of the Commander deck series, is Tahngarth, First Mate. He's a political aggro card. If he wants to attack, he can keep attacking whoever, because anytime someone else attacks, Tahngarth can go with them, and you can make him attack that person. Makes for an excellent Gruul commander if you really just want to beat people up with commander damage. But very, very strong. And he's a 5/5 for 4 instead of a 4/4 for 5, so much better on that front. And if you've got a way to buff him at all, and this deck does have some of that, excellent full-time beating character. Next up is another one of the animal members of the crew, and that is Mirri. She's a cat folk warrior that was exiled from her tribe because she has eyes of 2 different color. Actually grew up with Gerrard and Robelos around Multani, and so when Gerrard joined the Weatherlight and the Legacy, Mirri went with him. She is a powerful warrior who also has 2 cards. Only one of them I feel is actually really good for Commander. Both of her cards are good, but it's just about context and how useful they are in this format. The first one that I do not like as much was her original card from Exodus, and that's Mirri Cat Warrior. She's a 2/3 vigilance, first strike, forest walk for 3 mana, which is a lot of keywords, and it's powerful, but it's not going to do a lot. She'll be unblockable a lot of the time because just a lot of folks will have forest incidentally, especially if you run Yavimaya in the deck, which I highly recommend because fixing. So that's okay,
but it's not doing a whole lot else compared to a lot of the other creatures that have some sort of extra effect built to them, like Tahngarth's Arena combat effect or Hannah getting your artifacts and enchantments back. You might as well just be a small vanilla creature. Not necessarily worth it. Her other card, however, for Mirri is Mirri Weatherlight Duelist, which came out in the Cat Tribal deck from Commander 2017, I think. And that is the card that I felt that Mirri always deserved. It is excellent for keeping folks from attacking you, and she's hard to get rid of. She's great for poking at people because she just reduces the amount of attacking and blocking that can be done at you. So she's got really, really useful political power as well as just divergence. So Mirri, excellent choice as far as this deck is concerned. Weatherlight Duelist. Next member of the crew is undoubtedly the most famous far and away as far as Magic's lore is concerned. This guy has more card references than almost anybody else in the crew, depending on whether or not you count Urza. And that is our boy, the Silver Golem, Karn. He's a time-traveling pacifist of Teleria, built by Urza and Baron, made out of silver so he could successfully go back in time, and has survived for thousands of years, has become a planeswalker himself. All of this crazy stuff has happened to Karn. And there are so many versions of Karn that are powerful. His original creature card, of course, Karn Silver Golem, that lets you turn artifacts into creatures, which not only is good for assisting in removal, getting powerful creatures to attack, but it can also do things like pop artifact lands. All sorts of crazy stuff that's powerful for. And of course, there's all of his Planeswalker cards, none of which are bad choices to add to this deck, since Karn was not a Planeswalker while he was part of the original Weatherlight crew. My current build of the deck does not feature any of them, but that's another one of my incredibly high purity standards for building these types of decks, and I don't think anyone would begrudge you putting Karn Liberator, or especially Karn Scion of Urza, into this deck if you were to work on one. Both of which are, of course, excellent choices. Karn Liberated is great anywhere. But that's all of the stuff for Karn, and one of course, Magic's longest running characters. The next member of the Weatherlight's crew we're going to talk about is our intrepid Goblin Cabin Boy, and that's Squee. Squee's cards did not come out until about halfway through the Weatherlight saga, after he was made immortal so that someone could kill him over and over and over again because they hated him so much. So both of his cards are reflective of the fact that he's been made immortal, which is actually very, very useful. It makes the cards excellent jump blockers, makes them great sacrifice targets, because both of Squee's cards are really, really great at recurring. The first one is Squid Goblin Nabob. Just, if it's in your graveyard, it comes back to your hand every turn. So just play him, sack him, get him back, throw him out there again. He's a 3-mana 1/1, so he's a little expensive, but the fact that he's never, ever going to run out, pretty great. And the second one is Squee the Immortal, who you can just cast from the graveyard or from exile. So he's even harder to get rid of than the original. He's a 2/1 for 3 instead of just a 1/1, which is a little bit better for combat purposes if you're going to use him for that. It's a little bit harder to cast in a 5-color deck because 2 red dependency, but that's usually not going to be a problem. Both of these are great to just have around, but it's also totally fair to just run one of them if you don't want to have to deal with having 2 slots to what are effectively 2 useless creatures. Next up is Orem. Orem serves as the Weatherlight's chief healer, as well as the ship's bookkeeper. She handles all of the payment and money management, and she's also the ship's tailor. Does a whole lot of jobs on the boat, but the one that's important as far as the game is concerned is the healer section of that, because the card name is Orem Semite Healer. She's only got 1 ability, and it's actually a pretty strong one because it costs no mana. It's a tap effect, but it's tapped to prevent 3 damage from any source. So That does goes a long way as reliable, repeatable damage prevention, especially in EDH, when you'll get things like a Nekuzar, which will just do static attrition damage every turn. So she's really good at shutting down those effects, the things that are just slow bleed outs over time. Orem's really useful for that. Also, just any unwanted combat damage, especially from an incoming commander. She can help prevent that. So, great to keep around. Not exactly an exciting card, but she's part of the crew, so she's in the deck. And there we go. You'll like Orem a lot more when we get to what Orem's named character cards, her spells do, for Orem becomes excellent. But we'll get to those later. Next up is Stark. Stark is a deckhand that joined the crew back during the Mirage block era, helped them fight Meraxus of Keld by actually turning on him, and he is kind of a shifty character. He's only got one card, but it is an interesting one, and that's Stark of Wrath. He is targeted removal at no cost, instant speed, just a tap. However, since this character is a notorious backstabber, you do have to give Stark to whoever you destroy the permanent of. So it's got an interesting political angle, but is dangerous to use. Certainly, since the good news is most of the cards in this deck are not inherently very threatening on their own, as far as your permanents are concerned, other than really just like Sisay herself. Probably the most threatening because of her ability to tutor everybody out. Stark's pretty solid. If you've got a sacrifice outlet, it's useful to tap him, kill somebody, sacrifice him to something, so that's an option as well if you've got instant speed sacrifice effects. Or just to keep somebody from winning and give them a piece of removal in the meantime. Alright, so the next three are a little iffy, but I like including them anyway because they do all serve on the Weatherlight, just not for quite as long as most of the other characters. And the first one is Multani. I like Multani the most out of these three to include because he's not only partially part of the crew, also the primary donor of the wood that made the ship. And he's got two cards, but only one of them is really important for this particular deck, the one that I like to run, and that is Multani Morrow Sorcerer, who is just an excellent card for Commander. He is so very big, with power and toughness equal to cards in all players' hands. So at any given moment in a Commander game, he'll be rocking a power somewhere between 10 and 20. So very big, and he comes with Shroud. So anytime you've got somebody with no blockers, Multani is just ready to potentially one-shot players in EDH. So he's going to be one of your win con creatures. It's hard to augment him with this deck. There are some ways, and we'll talk about that as we go. But really, Multani, very strong creature. Next on our list of the iffy characters is Urtai. Urtai is a student from Teleria, one of Baron's best students, knows Urza, a very powerful wizard, and he is the one who Baron assigns to the Weatherlight when they go on their first adventure, and he is an important part of the crew for that. However, he's only a part of the crew for that adventure because they leave him behind and he gets kidnapped and turned into the enemy. And so he has two cards. One of them is while he's still a part of the crew, and that is Urtai Wizard Adept, which is the one I prefer to run in this deck because it fits the theme a little bit better. He's only a 1/1 for 4, but he has an activated ability that is just a counter spell. And that is very strong, especially in EDH. He does broadcast, so if somebody's got removal to get rid of him quickly, it's going to happen. But if you can stick him and hold up the mana once he's not summoning sick anymore, see, very powerful creature to help control the board and move it in the direction that you want. Very useful political tool to be able to sit around and wave a counterspell at people. His other card, which is the better of his two cards, depending on how you look at it, is Urtai the Corrupted, which is also a counterspell on a stick, costs less mana, he's a bigger creature, does come with a cost of sacrificing creatures or enchantments to do the counterspell. This deck has some decent outlets for that, so it's pretty doable, and he can sacrifice himself, so in a pinch, if there's something you really need to stop, great, do it. And just the fact that it's a broadcast, hey, I have a counterspell ready, gives you that political edge in a game of Commander. The last member of the Weatherlight crew that we're going to talk about, this is your primary creature suite, is Krovax. Krovax is one of Gerrard's friends, grew up with him in Robelos, and he's just one of the Weatherlight's warriors, and only, again, like Urtai, part of their initial adventure. So he has his family tied to a cursed angel, which is Selenia, who's also a card who you could include in this, but less the point. His curse, however, will end up eventually completely consuming him. He gets turned into a vampire at one point. He's forced to kill the angel that protects his family, and he goes insane and is picked up by Volrath in the future and is turned into one of Yawgmoth's Evankars to assist with the Phyrexian invasion later in the story. And he keeps being an important character throughout all of the plot, but he spends most of his time as a villain and not actually as a member of the Weatherlight crew. So I do keep his original card in the deck, which is, of course, Krovax the Cursed. He's kind of meh. He's a old school kind of vampire where you sacrifice creatures to him to put counters on him, or if you don't sacrifice creatures to him, he loses his counters. It's kind of odd, but luckily, if you've got Squee, sacrifice Squee to him, which of course is very, very flavorful, because once Krovax becomes the Ascended Evankar, which is technically his second card, Ascended Evankar is Krovax. It is a legendary creature. He's the one who gives Squee the immortality, so that he can kill him over and over again, because Krovax hates Squee. Huzzah. So that's Krovax's card. It's all right. Not much you can do with it. I don't really like to run Ascendant Evankar or Krovax Ascended Hero, which is technically his third card, which was from Plane Shift, because one, it's alternate timeline Krovax, so it doesn't really make sense, and two, neither of these cards are very good because they buff one color of creature and give penalties to every other color, so it's usually more detrimental than it would ever be helpful to run either of the other two Krovax cards. So sticking with Krovax's Cursed is really just the way to go. So that's it for the creatures, except Robelos. Robelos is technically part of the Weatherlight crew, but he is banned in EDH because he is too powerful, which he is if he were the commander or just in a mono green deck. In this deck, he'd actually be terrible because there's maybe like 5 forests total in this deck, so you're not going to want to run that because that's all he does is add green mana. The odds that he'll add anything at all if you play him earlier is pretty low. So great, we got there. That does wrap it up for all of the original crew of the Weatherlight. There is, of course, everyone who serves on the ship from the Dominaria set in 2018. There's Joyra, Gideon, Liliana, Teferi, Karn, again. And then there's the descendants of the original crew, which have all of their own cards as well. I'm not going to get into those because this is going to be a long enough endeavor already. If you want to look any of them up, they would be good adds if you want to just have more powerful creatures in the deck. But for this particular loadout, we'll be talking about the original story of it, and if cards fit into that potentially, like the new Weatherlight vehicle card, great, but not all of these new characters do, so we're just going to skip them. Next, we're going to move on and start talking about some of the more powerful spells that are available to you. The theme that I'm going to go over mostly is sort of the combat manipulation theme, where we've got a lot of enchantments and cards to help kind of push the combat step of everyone's turn in the direction that you want it to go. So you kind of have more say in how combat damage is dealt out, which is good for you because you do have some creatures that care a lot about the combat step, like Mirri, Weatherlight Duelist, and both of your Tahngarth cards, whichever ones you're running, but also because you don't have that many creatures to begin with, and also, more importantly, creatures that are slightly less powerful. So if you can manipulate the combat to go the way you want it, you've got a better chance of kind of coming out on top by forcing your opponents to really mess with each other. Now, there are dozens and dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of cards that could fit in this deck. I'm not going to go over every single one of them. I'm just going to go over some top picks. If you want, I highly suggest going to Scryfall and picking your favorite character and inserting them into the lore finder, and it'll bring you up every card for that character that references them. So if you want to lean in one direction or another, or try and find every single card that you possibly could that could go into a deck like this, that's my recommendation. But this is just going to be a relatively short list of all of the things that are available. And the first one of those that I like is going to be Mercadia's Downfall. This card showcases the Weatherlight escaping from Mercadia as it all kind of starts to collapse towards the end of the story. And this card is your instant speed overrun. This is for once you've got a very, very good combat step where you've got a few creatures coming through. You play this at instant speed, and it gives all of your creatures a boost based on how many non-basics your opponent has, how many non-basic lands. And since this is Commander, the odds that you're going to have at least one or two opponents with a lot of non-basic lands, if you play this late game at the right time, you can come in and get in with 3 2/2s and turn them into 12/12s, no problem, and just turn that into a dead player out of nowhere. Very, very powerful instant speed card. Next one is Safeguard. In Safeguard, we see Hannah being very, very excited about Orem using her healing magic properly. And this card is a targeted fog. You can just be like, that creature's not doing combat damage, which is good for protecting your own stuff. It's good for political usage to be like, hey, that creature that you have that I like isn't going to die in this combat step, so use it to block and save yourself and keep it alive. So on and so forth. And since it's repeatable, you can kind of spread that out to where you want it. Really useful card. Next up is Propaganda. In Propaganda, we see Volrath trying to manipulate Karn while he was captured by Volrath. Of course, Propaganda, very common, very powerful card all on its own. Keeps people from attacking you, tries to make them go in other directions. Always great, keeps you safe. Propaganda. And then we have Charisma is next. This is an aura that lets you gain control of creatures as long as you control the character enchanted with Charisma. And of course, the art is Gerrard being the perfect man. So ridiculous. But once you use some of these cards to start forcing attacks and blocks in the way you want, it becomes really great at just stealing your opponent's creatures forever. If you can protect the Charisma character, you get a whole lot of value out of that card. Next is Debt of Loyalty. It's another gain control effect, especially if there's a creature that's about to die. You can save it at instant speed and gain control of it. So this is a very, very useful gotcha card that can help swing games one way or the other if something's about to die. Then we have Dueling Grounds. Dueling Grounds shows off Sabo Tavak and Gerrard fighting one another during the events of Invasion. This narrows down combat to only being able to attack or block with one creature at a time, which is pretty useful to this deck since it does not actually have a huge suite of creatures. So it keeps people from attacking too hard if you don't want them to. So very, very useful enchantment. And then there's Invasion Plans, which shows us Gerrard and Miri when they discover Volrath's plan to invade Dominaria. It means that blocking becomes forced, but attackers choose how creatures block. Now, this can be dangerous for you because this deck has a lot of creatures that you kind of want to survive. But with all the other combat manipulation tricks that we've got, should be pretty easy to make this go the way you want, especially with something like Charisma. For example, if you have a character with Charisma up and you have Safeguard available, you can use Invasion Plans to attack with that character, safeguard them from taking any combat damage, then they ping all of the opponent's creatures that you want to take, ping them with the Charisma, and then, bam, you got all of that stuff just comes right back to you. And it's awesome. It's kind of a long-winded combo that takes a lot of mana and a whole lot of mana dependency, but hey, it's cool stuff that works, fits the theme, and people don't see it coming because this is a deck that does one of the things that I love the most when playing any sort of competitive game, is playing a card and having someone look at me and go, what does that do? Is my absolute favorite reaction from any player, just because I love obscure nonsense, which is why I'm making this video series, because it's about obscure nonsense. Okay, but moving on. The next card on the list is Invasion Plan. No, we just did Invasion Plans. Uphill Battle. And Uphill Battle is during the Mercadia War, where Gerrard and Cho Mano are teaming up. And it just makes creatures your opponent's control enter the battlefield tapped, gives you some more time to work around things, prevents any big haste bomb shenanigans. Useful effect, appears on a lot of stuff. Being in mono red makes it a more interesting thing. And next up is Orem's Chant, which is one of Orem's super, super, super powerful cards. It's 1 mana to stop a combat from happening if you don't want one, or if you kick it, it also stops them from playing spells. So you can just completely shut off a player's turn with Orem's Chant if it looks like they're about to win, and that is just so powerful on the right circumstances, especially if their win con involved them sacrificing things that they won't get back if that turn ends. So excellent card. I have won so many games because of a good Orem's Chant at the right time. And Orem's second card, which is Orem's Prayer, an excellent life gain card. Nice little enchantment that just sits around and gets you all the life back if people decide to attack you. Mostly it's a deterrent, but we want those. Another propaganda style effect. So, awesome. Another one of our excellent red enchantments here is Hand to Hand, in which we see Tahngarth and Greven going at it. And it just shuts off folks using instants or special effects during combat. So it lets you plan combat and not have to worry about any shenanigans going on while you do it. And since most of your combat manipulation comes from these enchantments, rather than playing too many instants or anything, it's usually going to be better for you than it is worse. See, and the last one of these combat manipulation themed cards is Heatstroke, which just any creature that blocks or becomes blocked dies at end of combat. So it just gets things dead. This is great if you've got one of your Squees available, or if you've got stolen creatures from Charisma or Debt of Loyalty. Really, really useful, and turns combat into a deadly proposition, which usually if someone's attacking you, their creatures will often be larger than yours because there's not a lot of huge creatures in this deck, which is fine. But useful card, very powerful. And of course, and the lore for this one is Meraxis of Keld taunting Stark right before Stark turns on him and stabs him in the neck. In addition to the combat manipulation theme, there's another little theme in here we're going to talk about, and that is this deck's ability to run cards that just hate the crap out of some other powerful themes that you'll see in EDH a lot, which is really, really fun to do. It's not always the most fun to play against when people run these cards, but since we're a really limited deck with a relatively low power level, I think it's fine to run some of these. First card in that list that I really, really love is Energy Flux. One of the versions of this card features Hannah and Karn looking together at the Legacy, and Urza. This card is actually really good at fighting against Urza, who is featured on some of the earlier arts and different arts of this card, which is hilarious. It makes it so that people need to pay 2 colorless per artifact that they have every upkeep, or sacrifice the artifact. So any deck that cares about total number of artifacts, just going to get totally swept away. It requires as much mana as 2 Tolarian Academies to keep your board state active. So if someone's playing some crazy go-off artifact shenanigans, just totally shuts it off. Next card that we've got up is the Null Rod, one of the artifacts from the Legacy. It just shuts off all artifact activated abilities. It's another good one for hating out artifact decks that rely on setting stuff up to do combos. So if you've got problems with people doing weird stuff with artifacts, Null Rod. Really, really great card, and one of the best flavor texts of all time. And that's, it's not that it doesn't do anything, it's that it does nothing. Which, language. See, next one is Hannah's Custody. Now, this card is a little bit stranger. I mean, it doesn't do a strange thing, but why it hates out other decks is very important. And so it gives all artifacts Shroud, which makes it impossible to target. So if someone's got any sort of weird gimmick going on where they have to, like, tap 2 things to untap another target thing, or you have to choose target artifact and do something with it, really, really messes with those strategies, because people a lot of times need to target their own things to have their decks go off. So really, really, really excellent choice there. And of course, Hannah's Custody is art about Hannah taking care of the Legacy. Super simple. The next one, Honor the Fallen. Now, this card is Orem, helping lay a bunch of dead people to rest and doing burials. And this card just really, really goes out of their way to hate out Reanimator decks or anyone with any serious graveyard interaction, because it's an instant speed spell that exiles all graveyards and gives you a ton of life when you do it. It is an excellent response if someone tries to play a Rise of the Dark Realms or a Living End or any of these massive, massive reanimate spells that are very, very common in EDH. Honor the Fallen will just put an end to that, gain you a ton of life, and probably completely hose what this other person's trying to do. Next one is Sudden Impact, specifically the one from Tempest, which depicts Gerrard falling off of the Weatherlight, which is great for when someone goes off with a card draw effect. Like if someone's doing Peer and Toothy, and he pops and someone just draws like 30 or 40 cards. Well, Sudden Impact, really, really great for just totally decking that person. This is a card that I feel is a very powerful EDH card as a good gotcha, because there's too many of those that just get not used very much, that will be lethal shots against people that are about to win. Okay, for the last little bit, I'm just going to go over another small handful of cards that are very, very powerful that fit the theme. So ones that you should probably run if you're looking at making this deck and just want to have some of the best possible cards in it. First one is Vindicate, one of the best removal spells ever printed. 3 mana, gets any permanent off the table, can pop lands, creatures, planeswalkers, enchantments, whatever you need. The artwork, of course, features the Weatherlight and the Predator firing at one another. So just excellent removal for whatever you need to get rid of. Next one is even bigger removal, and that is the Legacy Weapon. Legacy Weapon, of course, just repeatable exile of any permanent, gets anything off the board. There's not a whole lot of ways that this deck has to really fuel it non-stop, but you can play the Legacy Weapon and just start popping off your problems. It's great. And if somebody destroys it, it goes back into the deck. If you can get Sisay big enough, she can just haul it right back out. So great, super useful. Next one. This one is a dangerous one, and that is the Allurin. enchantment. It's from Tempest. It features quotes about Squee and Mirri talking about how Wrath's creatures come into existence. And it's dangerous, but since this deck does tend to feature a lot of more inexpensive cards, you can just jam them out into the world, help save you some mana. Really good for things like Urtai, to be able to play him and then have the mana up for him, or more mana available, things like that. Next one of the most dangerous spells, but also probably key to a lot of your win cons, and that's Cataclysm, that has you just pick one of everything and sacrifice the rest. And this is, like we mentioned, with Gerrard Weatherlight Hero. If you can successfully couple these two cards together, this is your best chance for clearing out the entire board and then bringing all of your stuff back immediately. So, excellent combo there. Cataclysm, great stuff. Next one is Mirri's Guile, which is, I honestly like it more than I like Sensei's Divining Top, mostly because it doesn't make everyone else at the table hate me whenever I just go top, and in response to everything they do top, it just lets you get a good feel for what you're going to draw during your upkeep, and if you've got extra draw effects, how you're going to interact with them. It's not super exciting, but it's very powerful. And of course, features Mirri. And the last one that I'm going to go into a lot of detail about is Erratic Portal. Erratic Portal is depicting the portal that goes from Wrath back to Dominaria that the Weatherlight uses to travel. It's the portal that they escape from when they flee Wrath. And it's a very useful artifact for mostly saving your own creatures by getting them back into your hand without having to worry about paying for it. But if somebody taps out to play something really powerful and doesn't notice, great. You've got the Erratic Portal. Keep on bouncing it. There's a lot of other cards too that I like. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through all of them. Just a couple names off the top of my head. Dregs of Sorrow, Sift, Broken Fall, Legerdemain, Squee's Embrace, Distorting Wake, Legacy's Allure. There's a lot of these cards that feature these characters, talk about parts of the story that are really strong. Like I said, I'll list everything that I've got in the deck currently in my current incarnation of it, which honestly probably isn't even as up to date as it should be, all things considered. But that's not the point. But that's all of the non-land cards in the deck. I'm not going to go too hard about the lands. Really, whatever lands you can get that really satisfy a 5-color deck's needs. If you can get 10 dual lands, 10 shock lands, 10 fetch lands, great. Do it. If not, just do your best to get things that can really go wide on colors to be able to do things like activate Sisay. There's only one real suggestion for lands, and that's use whatever legendary lands you can. I would recommend Urborg and Yavimaya because they help with fixing and they're legendary. And since Sisay can pull legendary permanents out of the deck and into play, that does serve as a form of ramp. There's only one land that's actually really, really pertinent to kind of the whole story, and that's the Volrath Stronghold, which is nice, but it's one of the enemy's things, and you could still run it because it's a good creature retrieval card, but not really a mandatory one. So that's it. It's a big list of cards from all over the map. They kind of all tie together to fit this theme, to care about these characters. Of course, there's tons of options we didn't look at. Plenty of ways to tweak this while still staying on theme. You could add the new crew mentioned. You could add some of the Gatewatch members. You could add the villains. Volrath has 2 very, very powerful cards. Greven Ilvek. All sorts of stuff that has Krovax on it. Things like Phyrexian Tyranny. So on and so on and so on. But if you are interested in this sort of deck, this will give you a really, really good framework and then let you fill it out with whatever you would want to do. Thanks so much for joining me for the second episode of Magic the Gimmicking. If there's a weird and obtuse EDH gimmick that you would like to see made into a powerful deck, feel free to tell me about it in the comments. As always, please like and subscribe so that I can keep making these. I'm MC Squared here at Zulu's Board Game Cafe. Thanks so much, everybody, and happy commandering.